As a key muscle of the posterior chain and a primary extensor of the hip, the gluteus maximus is essential for explosive power and forward propulsion, making it critical for functional fitness, athleticism, and sporting performance. It is also critically important for shape, appearance, and physical attraction. Almost everyone loves a shapely derriere. The gluteus maximus is one of the gluteal muscles, along with the gluteus medius and gluteus minimus. The gluteal muscles are collectively called the glutes, but people often use the word glutes to mean only the two gluteus maximi. In this video, you will learn the fundamentals of how to develop fantastic gluteal muscles with a focus on the gluteus maximus. I will explain what exercises you should do and how you should do them for maximum impact, while minimizing activation of your quadriceps, if that's what you want to do, and reducing your risk of developing muscle strength imbalances. Let's start with a quick but essential lesson on hip joint movements. Your hip joint is where your upper leg connects with your pelvis. Your hip joint can be articulated in many different directions by different muscles. The muscles that we are interested in are the gluteals. The three gluteal muscles are responsible for a range of hip movements. In order to develop great gluteals, you need to perform exercises that target these movements. The most important ones to target, especially if you want to focus on developing the gluteus maximus, are hip extension, hip external rotation, hip horizontal abduction, hip adduction, and hip abduction. This will ensure that you target all of the movements of the gluteus maximus and nearly all of the movements of the other gluteals. The great news is that you only need to perform a small number of exercises to target these movements. Let's look at each of these movements one at a time and the exercises that best target them. Hip extension is a movement in which the hip joint is straightened after being flexed. If your leg goes behind your body, it's known as hip hyperextension, but we'll keep it simple and just call it all hip extension for now. Hip extension doesn't necessarily only mean lowering your leg after raising it. It can also mean straightening your body after leaning forward. The primary muscles involved in hip extension are the gluteus maximus and hamstrings. These muscles can extend the hip because they are positioned on the back of the body and cross over the hip joint. Notice that the hamstrings also cross over the knee joint. This means that the hamstrings can not only extend the hip, but also flex the knee. This also means that if the knee is flexed, the hamstrings become a little loose and thus weak, especially if the hip is straight. If the hip is flexed as well, the hamstring will become more taut and stronger. The hamstrings are at their strongest when they are stretched by flexing the hip and extending the knee. This is why the lying leg curl machine has a bend in it. It is also why the barbell good morning is a brilliant exercise for targeting the hamstrings. But why is all this important? It's important because our goal is to build killer gluteus maximi. And to do this, we need to minimize activation of the hamstrings and maximize activation of the gluteus maximus. This can be achieved by performing exercises that involve extending the hip while keeping the knee flexed. Can you think of any such exercises? Enter the hip thrust. The hip thrust, which you could do effectively with either a barbell or a Smith machine, is arguably the most effective exercise for building the gluteus maximus because it involves keeping the knee flexed while extending the hip. Since the hamstrings are relatively loose and thus weak, the gluteus maximus is forced to do most of the work. Another reason this exercise is great is that you can use a ton of weight relatively safely, which is essential to fully overload the muscle. What's more, with the hip thrust there is relatively little activation of the quadriceps, making it ideal for people who want to build their gluteus maximus without building their quadriceps. This is true of most ladies in my experience. If you want to target hip extension and build your gluteus maximus with minimal quadriceps activation, you could also use the Smith machine kneeling squat. Of all the squat variations, this one activates the gluteus maximus most because the knees are almost fully flexed, which, you are reminded, helps to keep the hamstrings loose and weak. There is minimal quadriceps activation because there is minimal knee extension. What's more, since there is a relatively small amount of movement, even in the hips, the exercise allows you to use very heavy weights to thoroughly overload your gluteus maximus. One problem is that this exercise is not good for your knees, especially if you go very heavy, so I recommend that you use it sparingly and make sure you use the safety pins of the Smith machine. If you don't mind significant quadriceps activation, another great exercise that's fantastic for hip extension and building the gluteus maximus is, of course, the squat. However, you can reduce quadriceps activation and maximize gluteus maximus activation by using either a Smith machine or a hack squat machine and putting your feet forward. This is known as the Smith machine or hack machine chair squat for obvious reasons. Quadriceps activation is reduced because there is less knee extension. Notice that a very similar movement can be achieved with the leg press machine. Just put your feet high up on the platform to reduce activation of the quadriceps and maximize activation of the gluteus maximus. Yes, you can use either one or both legs. In fact, there are quite a few other exercises that follow the same movement pattern and are therefore great for the gluteus maximus. For example, try the cable high step up. The taller the box or stool, the more you will emphasize the gluteus maximus. Let's now look at the other hip movements we have to target to build killer glutes. The second hip movement is hip external rotation. In this movement, you rotate your thigh so that your knee points out to the side. Along with the gluteus maximus and the posterior fibers of the gluteus medius, several small non-gluteal muscles of the hip are involved in this movement. The good news is that we don't need to discuss these, as we did the gluteus maximus and hamstrings in hip extension. We also don't need to discuss many exercises. Quite simply, to target this movement and thoroughly activate the gluteus maximus, just externally rotate your hip at the end of a cable hip extension. Of course, the hip extension part of the cable hip extension exercise activates the gluteus maximus and hamstrings as well. If you want to reduce activation of your hamstrings, you know what to do. Keep your body somewhat upright so that your hips are relatively straight and/or flex your knees a little. The third hip movement we want to target is horizontal hip abduction. This movement involves opening your legs while keeping your hips flexed. Along with a couple of small muscles in the hip, all three gluteal muscles are involved in this movement, making it important for developing fantastic gluteals. Probably the best exercise for this movement is the machine-seated hip abduction. Leaning forward puts some emphasis on the gluteus maximus, whereas sitting back puts more emphasis on the gluteus medius and gluteus minimus. The last two hip movements to target to build killer glutes are hip abduction and hip adduction. Hip abduction involves opening your legs while keeping your hips straight, and hip adduction involves closing your legs while keeping your hips straight. The hip abduction movement activates the gluteus medius, gluteus minimus, and tensor fasciae latae. An effective exercise for this movement is, quite simply, the cable hip abduction. By building these muscles, this exercise helps you to develop more shapely hips and thus an hourglass figure. The hip adduction movement activates the adductor magnus, adductor longus, and adductor brevis, along with the pectineus, gracilis, and the lower fibers of the gluteus maximus. A simple, effective exercise for this movement is the cable hip adduction. Use it to tone your inner thighs and lower gluteus maximus, complementing the muscles that you worked with the cable hip abduction and creating well-rounded, shapely hips and glutes. So those are the exercises that you need to build jaw-dropping glutes. For the best results, add them to a balanced, whole-body training program that overloads all major muscle groups of your body at least twice a week. Never just train your glutes. It is important to have a balanced body. Many muscles, including the glutes, have opposing muscles that also need to be trained. Otherwise, in time, you may develop muscle strength imbalances. Opposing muscles are those that activate when you perform the opposite movement. For example, the opposite movement to hip extension is, of course, hip flexion. Therefore, to balance the hip extension exercises that you perform to build your gluteus maximus, ensure that you perform hip flexion exercises to build your hip flexors. Such exercises include the decline sit-up and the weighted captain's chair leg or knee raise. In addition to following a balanced full-body training program, perform 3 to 6 sets of each exercise using 6 to 12 reps per set and resting for only 30 to 90 seconds between sets. This is optimal for muscle growth. Notice that I didn't say how much weight you should use, or did I? The amount of weight you should use is based on the rep range. I said to use 6 to 12 reps. This means to use a weight that is so heavy that you cannot do more than 12 reps per set, but you should be able to do at least 6 reps. You should also follow the 2-2-3 tempo for each rep. That is, 2 counts for the concentric movement, 2 counts for the hold, and 3 counts for the eccentric movement. Don't forget to keep increasing the weight as you get stronger and can do more reps with the weight. Remember, you should never be able to do more than 12 reps with the weight. To help with getting stronger, on some days train for strength. This means to perform 2 to 6 sets of each exercise, using 2 to 6 reps per set and resting for 2 to 5 minutes per set. The longer rest between sets is important to allow for recovery. Your rep tempo when training for strength should be 1-2-2. Another way to keep your glutes challenged and growing is to change the exercises that you use from time to time. This will allow you to hit different fibers of the muscle. For example, swap the Smith machine hip thrust for the hack machine or Smith machine chair squat. Don't forget the importance of diet for building muscle. You can't optimize muscle growth without being in a caloric surplus. This means that you must eat slightly more calories than your body needs to stay the same weight. Download a calorie counting app, such as MyFitnessPal, and use it to count your calories. It's a bit tedious at first, but it does get easier. Finally, don't forget the importance of rest. Your program must include a deload week every 8 to 12 weeks, during which you must stop training and allow your muscles to recuperate. If you want access to professionally designed and balanced weight training programs for both men and women, please visit my website, weighttraining.guide. The programs are totally free. On my website, you will also find a weight training guide, a cardio training guide, a body weight training guide, a power training guide, a muscle activation guide, a weight loss guide, a nutrition guide, cardio training programs, and an exercise database, all free. If you found this video useful, please let me know by smashing the like button, leaving a comment, sharing the video, and subscribing to my channel. If you would like to support this channel, please consider buying my ebook, which includes all the guides and training programs on my website, and it only costs $10.